This is Detective Moyers with the Sheriff's Department. We're out on a possible suicide, gunshot wound. No signs of a note or anything laying around anywhere. The gun's laying next to his left hand, which is curled underneath him. We got 3 fired rounds. What I have a problem with is one is where the round's at and the way he's laying. I'm not saying it stinks, I'm just saying it's strange.
2 weddings, 2 funerals, and attempted murder. Sergeant David Amburn of the Knox County Sheriff's Office and Assistant Chief Deputy L. Keith Lyon were the first officers to arrive at the scene. The door to Raynella's home was open, and Raynella was lying face down, motionless and quiet in the front yard. At first, Amburn thought that maybe Raynella had been shot. Amburn nudged her with his foot and said, "Ma'am." Raynella began heavy crying to the point where it seemed like she was having problems catching her breath. Amburn then helped Raynella up, and she began yelling uncontrollably. She had a rag in her hand, and there was no noticeable blood on her. The lack of blood on Raynella suggests that she didn't attempt CPR. She seemed out of it and hysterical. Raynella asked Amburn to help her husband, informed him where David had been shot and where he was, before she started talking what Amburn thought was nonsense. According to Amburn, Raynella seemed genuinely overcome with grief. Amburn and Lyon then left Raynella by herself out front while they went in the house to check on David. As they entered the house, there was the sound of what seemed like a clothes dryer going. The house was very dark, especially in David and Raynella's room. David was lying on the side of the bed with a pillow underneath his head and blankets tucked around his body. There was a revolver near David's left hand and pointing away from his head. There was a TV tray with a bowl of what looked like oatmeal along with toast and a glass of milk, none of which looked touched. Amburn and Lyon then went back out of the bedroom and checked the rest of the house to make sure there was no one else there. Amburn and Lyon checked all of the rooms, closets, and under the beds. When Amburn and Lyon had finished, there were other officers at the front door, and Raynella had been moved from the yard to the porch. According to Amburn, Raynella's vehicle felt lukewarm, like it had been driven somewhere in the past couple hours. Sergeant Robert D. Lee of the KCSO arrived at the scene shortly after Amburn and Lyon, and he had his own version of events. According to Lee, Lyon was alone in the foyer of the house, while Amburn was in the front yard. Lee recalled that Raynella appeared to be pretty upset. Lee rushed into the house because he thought it wasn't a good idea for Lyon to be alone in the house. Lee and Lyon went to the bedroom, checked on David, then backed out and waited for paramedics to arrive. The blood on David was jellied. Lee secured the scene and stationed himself at the front door. He started a crime scene log to keep track of everyone who entered the house. Lyon walked the paramedics into the bedroom, and they confirmed that David was dead. There was a lot of people on the property that afternoon, including approximately 30 civilians who congregated at the barn near the residence. However, none of these civilians were allowed into the house or near the crime scene. Detective Sergeant Perry Moyers of the KCSO was a lead detective in this case. He was next to arrive at the scene. Lyon and Amburn and Lee gave him a quick assessment of the situation. Moyers noticed a bullet hole in the headboard of the bed. The bed was later removed, and a bullet was recovered from the wall, approximately 20 inches above the floor. There was also a bullet hole in the mattress near David's body and the gun. Bullet fragments were later recovered from the bed frame and underneath the bed. David had an entrance wound just above his left eyebrow. Morbidity had begun to set in, but had not yet become fixed. This meant that David had been dead for more than 36 minutes, but less than 5 or 6 hours. The blood had started to pool on the bed and the floor beneath it. Blood on David and the bed appeared to be dried except for some blood still pouring out of his nose. There was a pillow between his head and shoulders. The sheets were tucked in around him up and down. There was no blood on the left side of the bed. The gun found next to David was a .38 caliber police special revolver. Moyers removed the gun. There was no blood splatter nor matter found on the gun that you would normally find when a person is shot while the barrel of the gun is in contact with the skin or from a very close range. Moyers opened the gun cylinder, and it contained 3 live rounds and 3 spent shell casings. The cylinder rotated clockwise. At the top of the cylinder was a spent Western shell casing, then 2 spent Remington shell casings, 1 live Remington round, and 2 live Western rounds. No fingerprints were found on the gun, and the live rounds, spent casings, and spent bullets were not tested for fingerprints. There were no signs that there had been a struggle in the bedroom. but based upon the evidence at the scene, Moyers began to suspect David's death was not a suicide. He believed that the blood splatter on the wall was not consistent with David having been shot where his body was lying. Measurements and photographs of the blood splatter were taken for later analysis. Moyers also noticed that the gunpowder around the bullet hole in the mattress appeared to be undisturbed. Based on this, Moyers concluded that the body was in the position it was found in and that the sheets were tucked in and around the body before the shot was fired into the mattress. Samples were taken from the hands of both David and Raynella to test for gunshot residue. Raynella also gave Moyers the clothes she and her daughter had been wearing that day for forensic tests to be performed. 3 latex gloves were found on a shelf over a toilet in a bathroom adjoining to the bedroom. An open Bible was also found on a counter near the sink in the bathroom. The police did not search any other rooms in the house besides the bedroom and the adjacent bathroom. The police did check the house for signs of break-ins because Raynella told Moyers that she had secured the place before she left and that when she came back home, it was still secure. There was no signs of a break-in, but none of the KCSO officers recalled checking to make sure the doors were actually locked. At first, Raynella told Moyers that she did not know where the gun came from or who it belonged to, but she later told Moyers that she thought the gun had belonged to David's deceased father. Detective Moyers was told that David had some special medical problem and was depressed because his mother had a terminal illness. When Moyers asked Raynella for the name of David's doctor, he gave Moyers an appointment calendar that had information for the doctor's appointments and journal entries that Raynella had wrote. Several entries from the end of January to March 8, 2003, Raynella described David as being hateful, controlling, and paranoid. In a couple of entries, Raynella had written that David had stayed in bed all day or that he had made her cry. Moyers asked Raynella about the dryer. Raynella alleged that she started the washer and dryer before she left in the morning. The deeds and the will that David had signed were now missing. Around 2 p.m., Cindy was working at the barber shop when she found out about David's death and rushed to the farm. When Cindy arrived at the farm, Raynella told her that David had committed suicide. She also told Cindy about the dementia and mood swings. When Cindy asked Raynella how her dad could have done this, Raynella replied, "Well, he killed cows." None of this made sense to Cindy. She never witnessed her father's behavior in any manner that Raynella was stating. Also, Cindy believed that David would never have hurt his face and would have been afraid that he would have been a vegetable. And David was right-handed, so why would he shoot himself with his left hand and above his eye that had the detached retina? At the time, Raynella's oldest daughter, Maggie, was a student at the University of Tennessee when she was told that something was wrong at the farm. On her way there, she learned of David's death. When she pulled up to the house, Raynella was on the front porch holding a rag and shaking and talking to Moyers. According to Maggie, Raynella's eyes were glassed over, almost catatonic, and she was crying. After a number of minutes, Raynella got worse and worse. Maggie feared that Raynella was going to die. Maggie then took Raynella to the hospital. Hobson drove Katie's car from the high school parking lot to Raynella's home that afternoon. As she pulled up, she saw Raynella being driven away by Maggie. It looked to Hobson that Raynella was close to being in shock, and she was very upset and had been crying. Raynella stayed with Maggie for 2 weeks after David's murder. Maggie claims that Raynella was a mess and sad and fragile. The next day, Knox County Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Darinka Malusnik-Palchin performed an autopsy. She deemed David's death as a homicide. Palchin said that David appeared to be well-built, well-groomed, and obviously took care of himself. She noted that he had quite a bit of hair spray in his hair. According to Palchin, the cause of David's death was a close-range gunshot wound to the forehead, above the left eyebrow. The entrance wound was a teardrop shape, suggesting that the bullet entered at a slightly downward angle. There was also a widespread area of stippling, which is unburned gunpowder embedded into the skin around the wound, on David's forehead, suggesting the distance between the gunshot wound and the muzzle was several inches. Palchin compared the stippling on David's forehead to the results from forensic testing, in which the gun found beside the victim was fired from several different distances. Palchin concluded that the stippling on the victim's forehead matched the stippling pattern created when the gun was fired from 12 inches away from a target, and that David's wound was definitely not a contact wound. According to Palchin, David's forehead wounds were extremely rare in suicides, and it would have been more rare for it to be a suicide with a no-contact wound. The bullet entered David's skull, crossed through the left hemisphere, and severed the victim's brainstem. The bullet then ricocheted inside the skull before stopping. Paul Chen concluded that David's death was pretty much instantaneous, and since the shot that had killed David was the second out of 3, that he wouldn't have been able to fire the last shot to the mattress. Paul Chen was unable to determine an exact time of death, but she estimated that it could be anywhere between just dead to about 6 hours, given that there was evidence that some cooling already occurred when the body was found. Paul Chen narrowed the range between 1 or 2 hours to 6. When Paul Chen examined David's brain, she found no evidence that he suffered from Alzheimer's. She did find that David's stomach was empty, but his bladder was full. Paul Chen took blood and urine samples to be tested for alcohol and drugs. The next day, David was cremated. David's daughter and most of his family and friends thought that this was odd, because David believed that cremation was wrong. He believed that cremated people didn't go to heaven. He also had a burial plot next to his parents. At David's funeral, Raynella told people that she was just David's hood ornament. And a few days after, she had David's ashes sent to Cindy. Sometime after David's death, that Hoyt Von Estelle showed up to the barbershop and delivered Cindy a cardboard box upon Raynella's request. Raynella had not told Hoyt that the box contained David's ashes, which Cindy then placed on a shelf of clean towels in the shop. On March 19, 2003, Randall Carr, the director of human resources at Park West Hospital, had a pretty unusual meeting with Raynella. Raynella had a clinical mask over her face, which she removed once she had been shown to a conference room. Raynella had her daughter and a private investigator with her, and was at the hospital because she had requested to interview several hospital employees. As one of the interviews was concluded, Raynella gave the impression that something had just popped into her mind. Raynella told Carr that she remembered meeting and speaking with a physical therapist who was working with David's mom on the morning of David's murder, and that must be noted in the medical record somewhere. Raynella also said that she remembered making a phone call to David to cheer him up in front of the physical therapist. Raynella had said that David didn't answer, and then she started crying. Carr checked David's mom's medical records, and the physical therapist made a notation about seeing Raynella that morning at 9:53 a.m. on the day of David's death. However, there were several entries in the chart at 9:53 a.m., and it was possible that the physical therapist met with David's mom earlier in the morning. There was also references in David's mom's medical records to Raynella having previously discussed her care with hospital employees. A few weeks after David's murder, Cindy found an empty holster in David's mother's underwear drawer. Cindy turned the holster over to Moyers. The gun found beside David fit inside the holster. The holster was tested for fingerprints, and 4 latent fingerprints were found, but not of sufficient quality to be identified. Raynella had David's mom's pocketbook and the house keys prior to David's murder. Raynella only visited David's mom in the hospital once after David's death, and that was to return her pocketbook and house keys. When David's toxicology results came back, there had been no trace of alcohol in David's system. However, there were drugs found in his system, drugs that he didn't have a prescription for. Demerol or meperidine, which was used to help relieve moderate to severe pain. It may also be used before and during surgery or other procedures. Senequin, used to treat mental mood problems such as depression and anxiety. Phenergan or promethazine, used to prevent and treat nausea and vomiting related to certain conditions, such as motion sickness or before or after surgery. It is also used to treat allergy symptoms such as rash, itching, and runny nose. It may also be used to help you feel sleepy, relaxed before and after surgery, or to help certain opioid pain relievers, such as meperidine, work better. The suppository form is used when medications cannot be taken by mouth. Promethazine is an antihistamine and works by blocking a certain natural substance, histamine, that your body makes during an allergic reaction. According to Paul Chen, the presence of the metabolite or pethidine in David's body was an evidence of chronic use of Demerol for at least several days. He also said that the amount of Senequin in the blood was bordering on toxic levels, and these 3 drugs taken together were a very unsafe combination to be used. Paul Chen surmised that the combination of drugs in David's blood did not make him completely unconscious, that David was probably really out of it, that based upon the level of drugs in David's blood, he could not have gotten out of bed that morning, gone to work, or driven a car. Paul Chen did not know how the drugs got into David's system, but theorized that they could have been mixed with food or injected. However, no needle marks were found. She thought that David could have ingested the drugs with relatively light food the night before his death and still have had an empty stomach at the autopsy. Retired forensic scientist and expert in bloodstain pattern analysis, Paulette Sutton reviewed photographs of the crime scene, as well as photographs and measurements of the blood splatter on the bedroom wall. Based upon the evidence she reviewed, Sutton theorized that the gunshot in the headboard was fired before the fatal gunshot to David's forehead. And since strands of the victim's hair were found in splinters caused by the bullet hole in the headboard, it meant that the bullet was fired into the headboard and then the hair came down into it and caught on it. When David was shot, blood traveled upward to the left, striking the wall at a 90-degree angle. The blood splatter was found on the headboard and on the wall right above it. Based upon the evidence, Dutton said that David was most likely in a raised position with his head near the top of the headboard when he was shot. Once shot, David's body would have dropped straight down. Sutton surmised that the blood splatter was inconsistent with the victim having been shot in the position his body was found in, or in a low position close to lying down. Sutton also came to the conclusion that David's death was a homicide.